Chapter 941 Training and Reward from the Succubus. Human beings, and perhaps all beings with intelligence and self-awareness in this universe, used to think with arrogance and narcissism that their lives were miserable at the slightest difficulty. However, how many of them actually sat down and thought carefully about whether their lives were as miserable as they believed? It would only take a second of opening their eyes and looking at their surroundings to realize that their lives were luxuries that countless dreamed of having while wallowing in true despair. Evangeline's past was by far one of the saddest and most tragic that Xietain knew of, if not the saddest of all. She had lost everything, absolutely everything, when she was but a 5-year-old girl. At the age when she should have been enjoying laughter and playing with her elementary school friends as well as the hugs and affection of her parents, she was being trained to become a killing machine after fate took everything from her except her life. Trying to put himself in her shoes, Xietain didn't have to be in that situation for more than a few seconds in his imagination to realize that if it were him, he definitely wouldn't have been able to continue on. Xietain looked at the girl in front of him with a complicated expression, but he didn't dare to look at her with pity. Giving a pitying glance to a woman like Evangeline that had fought with everything she had and gritted her teeth, enduring not only physical pain but also emotional and mental pain, would be disrespectful to her determination. If this woman named Christina is still alive, then you can do whatever you want with her, Xietain said as he looked into her eyes. Even if she is an innocent woman who has helped many people in the apocalypse? Evangeline stared at him as she asked indifferently. She knew the rules of the faction well, and especially the rules of Xietain. Evangeline didn't believe that he would break those rules just like that. However, she clearly didn't know him well enough. The so-called justice is nothing but an illusion created by us humans. So-called justice is nothing but a form of revenge covered by a word more pleasing to the ears, Xietain said in a cold voice. When someone murdered, they were sent to prison as punishment. This was the revenge that society imposed on the murderer. Justice was born out of the pain of someone who suffered some kind of physical or non-physical harm from another, and it was that pain that gave birth to vengeance that could be carried out by the victim, a family member, a friend, or the laws. He continued, laws exist to maintain order, and if preferable, I naturally hope that the rules we set will not be broken. However, there are always exceptions. Am I an exception? Evangeline asked. You are an important person to me. Xietain nodded and said in a serious voice, besides, betrayal in our faction is punishable through death. Since this woman named Christina betrayed you, then she deserves death even if she was one of the most devout angels of the God of Heaven. Evangeline's mouth opened slightly, and for an instant, Xietain thought he saw her lips curve upward slightly in what appeared to be an amused smile. However, this seemed no more than an illusion, since when he blinked and looked at her again, all he saw was indifference. Even if back then our faction didn't exist and I wasn't a part of it? She raised an eyebrow and looked at him doubtfully. Xietain waved his hand and said as if it was obvious, from the moment you were born you were destined to become a sole evolver of this faction and be my loyal follower. Everyone who hurt you in the past must naturally pay for messing with a destined member of my faction. Evangeline stared at him for a few seconds. Her eyes glinted peculiarly before she closed them and shook her head. I knew it. What did you know? Xietain asked, startled. She opened her eyes and said indifferently, you're out of your mind. Well, sorry for being out of my mind. Xietain rolled his eyes. During the approximately 5-hour flight, Xietain stayed in the collector's pocket world after sending Evangeline back to the outside world at her request. He walked away from the place where he had planned to build his shelter and thereafter began to train fiercely with the whip. The explosions from each swing of his arms as the tip of the whip reached the limit and then was abruptly retracted after hitting the void formed cannons of air that flew everywhere and caused no small level of destruction, causing the accumulation to worsen the scene even more. While accompanying him in his training for more than 40 hours straight, Lilith could not help but notice the speed of his improvement increasing more and more with each swing of the golden whip in his right hand. Of course, the training was not just about swinging and hitting the air stupidly. And it was thanks to Lilith that Xietan's training progressed so smoothly at astonishing speeds. He was very surprised when he saw her point to a spot in the distance, and an instant later several finger-sized targets formed floating in the sky. Ice? Xietain blinked in surprise when he realized that those black objects were actually small fragments of ice. Lilith, you have the skill Ice Maker, just like Bing Shui? This was the first time Xietain had seen Lilith use this skill. In fact, the only time he had seen her use her powers was on the bridge after her return to Earth when she controlled several sea plants to annoy Shangguan Bing Shui. It's something like that. Lilith chuckled and slowly replied, except my skill is slightly different. I see. Xietain nodded with a thoughtful expression on his face. Lilith smiled at this and after a moment of silence pointed to the targets in the distance as she calmly said, Xietain, try to hit them all using your whip. With your current level it would be a waste of time to do it while you are motionless, so move as fast as you can. While trying to hit the ice pieces, I will move them through the air so it will be even harder for you. Soon, explosions louder than before began to echo in the collector's pocket world, and as Xietain used all of his agility to move around while waving his whip, he found that while the difficulty was undoubtedly great since Lilith was also moving the targets, it was not something impossible to do even if there were certain occasional misses. Xietain was preparing to strike again with his whip when his expression changed slightly and out of pure instinct, he leaned his body back just in time to feel a gust of cold wind passing inches above his body. Boom! His eyes widened and his movements stopped as he saw a large patch of night black ice forming a short distance away, freezing everything around and releasing a mist that Xietain felt chilling even from his position. You don't have time to stop and be surprised. Xietan's expression changed slightly again when he heard Lilith's voice, and he quickly turned on his heels. He stomped on the ground hard and turned into a human cannonball, dodging the second attack, but with no time to feel joy as more and more were coming from everywhere. Hey, are you crazy? Xietain shouted angrily and worriedly as he moved in irregular patterns with surprising maneuvers that allowed him to narrowly dodge the hundreds of black ice swords slashing at him from all directions. Lilith remained standing in the middle of the ice objectives with a faint smile as she watched Xietain move all over the area. Ice swords formed above her head and her ruby-colored eyes took on a strange light that seemed to control the swords to attack him. Don't worry, the soul record will not punish me in this world, she said calmly and with the demeanor of a goddess as her dark hair swayed gently each time a sword or more passed by her. What? How can you be so sure? Xietain shouted, still worried as he struggled to dodge the attacks that kept coming. You silly boy, did you forget that in order to enter this world people cannot have any ill will towards you? The soul record surely knows that, so it's okay if I attack you a little. Lilith replied with a slight smile. After a brief pause, her eyes flashed and she added in a not-so-friendly voice, while my attacks certainly won't cause you serious injury, let alone kill you, they will certainly hurt. Strive to dodge them all as you break these ice shards around me. Xietain sighed a sigh of relief in his heart when he heard Lilith's reasoning. As long as she wasn't punished by the soul record, then all was well. Now calmer, he couldn't help but grit his teeth at her last words. You're fucking crazy. Ha ha ha, thank you. I wasn't praising you. Stop crying and focus, more attacks are coming now. You damn it. See if I don't leave your butt red as an apple when I catch you. This big sister will give you a juicy reward later if you manage to break all these fragments before it's time to go. A reward in bed, that's it. Xietain gritted his teeth and tried to find a pattern in the ice swords, but after a minute or two he gave up, when he realized that Lilith's attacks were simply irregular and without any chain linking them together. Although he could use his blood manipulation skill to forge weapons and block the ice swords or use gravity manipulation to misdirect their course, the intention of this training was to improve his reaction, reflexes, speed, and of course, the main goal, to improve his whip control. Boom. 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 The explosions echoed terrifyingly for more than 40 hours. 40 hours later, the scene was a disaster, to say the least. The beautiful green meadow had disappeared along with the trees and was replaced by a world of dark ice with craters of at least 20 meters in diameter everywhere. Although the ice was as black as night, the mist was white and now floated around, making the sun's rays sparkle like diamonds every time it passed through an icy molecule. The sound of Lilith's footsteps was accompanied by Xietan's heavy breathing, and when she stopped to step away and saw him panting with sweat covering his entire body, she couldn't help but let out a chuckle. "Not bad, little brother. Hee, even though it took you time, you managed to break all the ice fragments even under such circumstances." Not bad at all." Xietain opened his mouth with the intention of cursing her a little, but he didn't even have the strength for that. Even with his monstrously high stamina, it had been far from easy to dodge hundreds of attacks that moved at least 2 or 3 times faster than a bullet while attacking tiny distant objects that moved non-stop. After 40 hours of great effort, he managed to destroy the targets, but his stamina had worn out and dropped below 90%. Lilith looked at the parts of his armor that had layers of black frost and said calmly, "Even though you were hit more than 40 times, I have to admit that it is less than I expected. Besides, the cloak on your back weakened the power of my ice swords, so the pain you suffered was surely less than what you should have." Xietain rolled his eyes and in his heart vowed revenge later when he recovered. Lilith smiled warmly and carefully helped him to his feet. "I think someone deserves a good rest, no?" As Xietain walked being supported by Lilith, he couldn't help but ask once he regained enough breath, "What about my reward?" Lilith looked at him a bit speechless before looking straight ahead again, putting on a mischievous smile and licking her lips. "Relax, Daddy Xietain. This little sister of yours will keep her word." Lilith really kept her word, and thanks to the care of her body, Xietain was able to sleep like a baby after releasing a different kind of burden more than 5 times without holding back at all. Chapter 942 Massacre and Rivers of Blood, Part 1. Xietain did not wake up until after a full 8 hours of sleep, during which he slept without interruption. Moreover, thanks to the treasure bed he obtained in the Eventide World dungeon, those 8 hours had the same effect as sleeping 16 hours, so when Xietain opened his eyes he felt so fueled up that he could fight another 300 rounds. Lilith was already awake when he opened his eyes, looking at him with a smile that stole his heart again. "Good day, Mr. Sleepyhead." "Good day, my little succubus." As Xietain left the collector's pocket world, the pilot shouted from the cockpit that it was about 30 minutes to the base. As he sat back down, Xietain couldn't help but feel a little weird as he looked at Shirlin and the other people in the helicopter. Perhaps realizing that something was not right with Xietan's gaze, Kong Lan frowned slightly and asked in a low voice, "Leader, is everything all right?" Xietain nodded slowly and after a few seconds said calmly, "Everything is all right, don't worry." The reason he felt a little weird was because while everyone had lived almost 5 hours, for Xietain it had been almost 50, about 2 days. However, the feeling was only short-lived and he soon ignored it, turning his focus back to what was to come. Exactly 25 minutes later, Xietain managed to spot a human base with huge wooden walls lined with what appeared to be shimmering stones with some reflective capacity against magic attacks. "Leader, this is the only base our transcendent faction has in all of Inner Mongolia." Kong Lan exploded in a serious voice as she looked out coldly. "Because this is not our territory and the enemy is too overwhelming. Splitting up to expand our territory was never an option. In fact, even maintaining this base is very challenging, and if not for the constant supplies that the base in the north of Chongping district provides on a weekly schedule, this base could not have been kept on its feet." Xietain nodded. He had earlier read the report Wu Yijuan's mother had prepared, therefore, he had knowledge of the situation in this part of the country. However, that is about to change. Xietain stood up and opened the sliding door of the helicopter, allowing the fierce winds to blow strongly, causing his hair and cloak to flap wildly as he looked down, indifferently. "My lord?" "Xietain, where are you going?" Qin Ming and Zhongda's mother quickly asked loudly while squinting their eyes due to the wind hitting their faces. Kong Lan, focus on healing Kai, Jingyi, and Shinmei. Evangeline, mark on a map all the important areas you know of in Russia, including military bases, satellite, nuclear, factories, granaries, and anything else you can think of. Bai Zemin ordered in a deep voice. Within a maximum of 2 days, Kai Jingyi and Shinmei will be back on the battlefield no matter how badly they are injured. Kong Lan stated, and when she saw Bai Zemin looking over his shoulder at her she couldn't help but smile with some pride. Leader, none of us had been fooling around during this half a year that you were not present. I believe we won't let you down. I see. I look forward to it. Bai Zemin nodded before looking at Evangeline. Leave it to me. She nodded calmly. Given her past, Evangeline naturally had knowledge of a lot of sensitive information. With her, taking down any Russian resistance would be far easier in the near future. Father! Bai Sherlin jumped to her feet and approached him. She clutched his cloak and said with excitement, Father, you're going to wipe out the bad guys? Let Sherlin go with you, yes? Pretty please. Bai Zemin looked at her for a moment before nodding, all right. Sherlin can come along with father. He was curious about how much his daughter had grown too. Yay! The girl's eyes sparkled and she didn't hide her excitement at all. Bai Zemin looked at Callie and asked, Powder, do you want to come? Callie shook her head and slowly said, I'll join you later. I see. I'll leave your chair here for you then. Bai Zemin nodded toward the people in the helicopter and without delay jumped down with Bai Sherlin in his arms. However, the two did not fall more than a few meters when Bai Zemin's feet stepped on an invisible step, and under the shocked eyes of the helicopter pilot he soon began to run across the sky as if he was stepping on solid ground. Watching Bai Zemin disappearing into the distant horizon, Qin Ming and Lan Xiang gasped. Kong Lan and Evangeline were both better since they had both seen Shangguan Bing Shui do the same thing before in the past. Although the two did not understand how the trick worked, it was clear that it depended on the strength stat, and since one of them was a mage focused on magic and mana while the other was an assassin focused on agility and stamina, they could not replicate such a thing. Bai Zemin had been running through the sky for about 5 kilometers when Bai Sherlin's voice startled him. Whoa! As expected from father, you two can run through the sky just like Sherlin. What? Bai Zemin looked at her in shock and subconsciously slowed down. Sherlin, you can do it too? She nodded and wriggled a little to get loose from Bai Zemin's embrace. He let her go, since this kind of fall wouldn't hurt her, not to mention that he could easily catch her again, but to his surprise, Bai Sherlin didn't fall but stopped standing next to him. He could faintly see the air around Bai Sherlin trembling, especially under her feet. Although Sherlin can do it, Uncle Kong Jun is much better. Bai Sherlin said sadly. Sherlin can only be in the sky for 15 minutes before she gets tired and has to go to sleep. Moving the muscles of the body like vibrators at high speeds for long periods of time using every strength point to affect the pressure of the surroundings was certainly exhausting. Even Bai Zemin could not sustain himself for more than an hour before exhausting most of his stamina. However, what surprised him was that Bai Sherlin could do it. Sherlin, can you tell father how many strength points you have? He asked with a silent gulp. Bai Sherlin paused and her eyes moved for a few seconds before she said with a bright smile, Sherlin has 2,452 strength points. Bai Zemin staggered and almost fell from the sky when he heard this. 2,452 strength points? For the love of Jesus Christ. Even he who was under the effect of 2 triggers of his blood berserker's wrath skill had only a little over 3,500 strength points. However, after thinking it through he realized that it was just natural. Bai Sherlin was the future queen of the Weaver Ants. In her body were the records of the last queen who was the most powerful of all the Weaver Ants whose natural strength was terrifying by nature. Moreover, Bai Sherlin was not stagnant, so she was absorbing soul power and gaining stats continuously, surpassing level 80 long ago. Not to mention that she also possessed records of him. Bai Sherlin was, without a doubt, an anomaly. If Bai Sherlin was not Bai Zemin's daughter and had not joined the human camp, probably no one on Earth would be able to control her in a couple of years. She would undoubtedly be the absolute ruler of all life on the mainland. It was only now that Bai Zemin realized how fortunate he and his team had been back in the ancient ruins in the 5 silver pagodas. Had it not been for the former Queen Sherlin, Kong Jun would have attacked them. And the Bai Zemin of that time certainly could not have defeated him unless he dropped a crimson blood judgment on himself in the midst of combat, which would end up resulting in the death of both of them. This was also proof that despite being on the same level, Bai Zemin's strength had never stopped growing. Ah, Uncle Kong Jun. Bai Zemin blinked in surprise at Bai Sherlin's cheerful call, and when he looked towards the ground in a southerly direction he saw a figure covered in a large black cloak, rushing towards them at thunderous speeds and destroying everything in his path. Bai Zemin hugged Bai Sherlin again and let himself fall from the sky, making a large crater after a loud explosion when his feet struck the ground. Kong Jun rushed over, closing the distance in an instant and raising a large cloud of dust as his feet slid across the ground. He first knelt before Bai Sherlin and his deep, serious, and somewhat robotic voice rang out from beneath the large cloak, "Princess Bai Sherlin." "Hee, Uncle Kong Jun. I see you still like to cover yourself with that big cloak of yours." Bai Sherlin smiled sweetly in response. She naturally knew that Kong Jun was a humanoid ant and had seen his appearance. But the girl was too pure and innocent to know that a big problem could arise among the humans, as they would be frightened if they saw such a monster walking among them. "Good job keeping the base on its feet, Kong Jun," Bai Zemin said. The real reason why the human base in Inner Mongolia was never taken down was the existence of Kong Jun acting as a guardian. Everyone, regardless of their numbers or strength, were crushed and turned into meat pulp when they approached the walls. Kong Jun was known as a hero by everyone in the Transcendent faction, even though only a handful had seen his appearance and knew his true identity. "Lord Bai Zemin, it's good to see you unharmed." Kong Jun slowly stood up and slowly said in a slightly breathy voice, "The princess missed you, often mentioning you." Bai Zemin nodded, noticing that Kong Jun seemed to have become a lot more used to speaking. He was no longer having as much trouble as before. "Kong Jun, do you want to join us?" he asked suddenly. However, Kong Jun shook his head and said in a deep voice, "From the East Sea there occasionally appear sea beasts that attack the base. Although Miss Xiao Xiao has her own soldiers, I'd better stay behind just in case." It was only then that Bai Zemin remembered Fu Xiefeng's word saying that the sea race had become involved in the war. However, there was something that puzzled him. Miss Xiao Xiao Xiao? Was she the same Xiao Xiao he knew? The little pink dolphin? Looks like I will really have a surprise when I see Xiao Xiao. If she stepped into the Third Order, then not only must she have become a lot stronger, but she must have also acquired her body transformation skill. Bai Zemin could not help but smile gently in his heart as he remembered the little dolphin who always loved to be in his arms as a baby. In the end, Kong Jun did not join Bai Zemin and Bai Sherlin but returned to the base as the duo turned into a gust of wind in a northeasterly direction. According to the documents Sun Ling had prepared for him, about 400 kilometers distant from his faction's base was the first major enemy base. This base had been erected by goblins, and apparently not only had millions of soldiers, among which there was no lack of powerful soul evolvers, but also had great defenses capable of shooting down human combat helicopters with ease, and only fighter planes were able to pass through thanks to their great speed. Chapter 943 Massacre and Rivers of Blood, Part 2. The Goblin Base under the name of Mother Fortress was the largest and most massive base of the Goblin race in the northern part of the Asian continent. This base was so large that its size was comparable to the entire Chongping district of Beijing City. With over 10 million goblins, among which all of them were fierce and savage soldiers, attacking this base was out of the question for all races except for the few straggling zombies that were not yet under the leadership of a zombie commander or zombie general. Whoever was the leader of the goblin race on this side of the world was certainly intelligent, This could be seen by the fact that the over 300-meter-high walls were made not of tree trunks but of giant stones. How long had it taken the goblins to move those boulders? Only they knew, but it was definitely a work of many months of effort. The gate was the only visible wooden construction, and it was large enough for a 100-meter-tall mutant beast to pass through standing upright. On top of the walls were magic cannons with nozzles over 10 meters in diameter each that glowed with faint blue light and purple sparks crackling on the surface occasionally. In the sky, a total of 5 airships, each about 100 meters long, hovered over the surroundings. Each gate had at least one airship serving as an eagle eye high in the clouds. Enemies would be seen even before they could see the gate of the mother fortress. Of course, apart from the airships whose power was not small at all, there was also a large army of over 50,000 goblins carrying all kinds of weapons camping 1,000 meters from the south gate. In one of the airships flying over the area, a second-order goblin in charge of leading this guard squadron was looking off into the distance with a carefree expression on his face in search of enemies. "Lord Blacks, how long will we have to put up with the humans? This is our territory," a first-order goblin said through gritted teeth as he glared at the control buttons in front of him with hatred. "They are physically weak, their infants are just useless burdens, they fear death, their numbers are small, they have no sense of unity, mentally unstable. What right do they have to set foot on our lands?" Another first-order goblin nodded. "I don't understand why His Majesty tolerates them. Not only did we join with a human faction that we could crush at will, but we can't expand southward. What is this all about? It makes no sense." The second-order goblin named Blacks opened his fanged mouth and said in a hard voice, "His Majesty naturally has his reasons. Our goblin race just needs time, and by the time our numbers grow to absolute, those humans will pay for their arrogance. Human females are really good. The only good thing about humans. This useless alliance at least provides us with several female beauties, kakaka. Let them be arrogant a little longer and they'll be our slaves before they know it." The goblin race was a cruel and bloodthirsty race with little control. Even for the leaders it was not easy to command the weaker goblins, as they often got out of hand and had to kill hundreds to warn the rest. Blacks didn't seem to mind if the soldiers under his command caused a little noise in the airship. In his eyes, all this made no sense whatsoever, as it was impossible for the enemy humans located to the south to attack the strongest base of the goblin race with millions of soldiers and whose defense was basically impenetrable. Just as such thoughts were going through Bok's head, the mighty second-order goblin's pupils contracted to the size of a needle when he saw a silhouette appearing out of nowhere standing right at the front of the airship. Sure, boom. The goblins on the walls and nearby were shocked, while those inside the city watched with eyes filled with horror as one of the airships turned into a fireball and plummeted straight towards the base. Swoosh! From the cloud of smoke and fire, Blacks flew backwards with medium-grade wounds and blood pouring from his body. Sucker! He was the only survivor. All the other goblins inside the airship had died in the explosion, and had it not been for his higher body as a second-order soul evolver, he would have been no exception. All of Black's hatred and anger were only there for a moment, as the next instant he felt an overwhelming amount of pain that took his breath away. Black's scream of pain extended over 1,000 meters as his body swelled like a balloon in an irregular fashion. Arms, legs, torso, fingers, head, everything about him swelled to bestial proportions before the inevitable happened. Boom! Broken skin mixed with hot blood and chunks of flesh flew everywhere, raining down from the clouds and signaling the beginning of the end. Enemy attack! The goblins immediately went into frenzy mode as the full-throated roar of one of the commanders standing at the top of the south wall spread far and wide in warning that everyone already knew. This same goblin was a second-order soul evolver and could feel great pressure from the human soul evolver, enveloped by a halo of golden light slowly gliding across the sky after smashing an airship and killing dozens of first-order goblins along with a second-order goblin. Zeman watched indifferently as the goblin who had shouted earlier took a step forward and pulled the string of a large purple-colored bow pointing in his direction before he looked down at the large goblin army below. Die. All of you. As his voice spread across the length and breadth of the battlefield, his words charged with magic power and mana vibrated within the bodies of the dozens of goblins, causing many of them to feel their blood begin to unnaturally overheat. Boom. 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 One after another, dozens of goblins began to explode per second, but in just a matter of blinks of an eye, those dozens became hundreds of goblins exploding one after another or at the same time, and in just an instant, the brown earth was stained with the goblins' purple-green blood. Sky Shatterer. Boom. Xietain heard the roar of the second-order goblin, and upon sensing a bit of danger he activated gravity manipulation in conjunction with blood manipulation at the same time as he extended his right hand outward. Boom. Yellow flames covered part of the sky, and Xietan's figure disappeared as the second-order goblin's arrow-like skill enveloped him. The second-order goblin had barely let out a sigh of relief when a voice so cold that it sent chills to him rang out from the clouds. You dare call that trash attack, Sky Shatterer? What? The second-order goblin felt shocked as he saw two glowing red eyes like lanterns watching him from within the yellow flames that soon faded away, revealing the human from before standing on a giant crimson shield and still enveloped by that strange halo of golden light. How dare you attack Xietan's father? A sweet but at the same time furious little voice sounded from above, and as the second-order goblin raised his head, his pupils contracted to the size of needles while he watched helplessly as the small fist surrounded by a white gauntlet of the fairy-like girl struck in his direction. Boom! The second-order goblin's body exploded into millions of tiny pieces as Xietain proudly towered over the trembling stone wall. Xietain, remember not to destroy the cannons. Father has use for those. Xietain said as he looked at the cannons casually. Okay. Xietain nodded, and her usually sweet and lovely face suddenly became extremely fierce. All the bad guys need to die. The goblins on top of the wall rushed at her, but Xietain was simply too fast. Making use of not only her agility stat but also her terrifying strength, she was like a ghost, and every time she stomped the ground beneath her feet she magically appeared in front of a goblin before that goblin's head exploded in a bloody mess. Kill her. Beautiful human woman dash. Catch her and just dash. The lust of the goblins was certainly terrifying, and Xietan's beauty colossally high despite being so young. Even as their companions were dying right before them, the goblins could not contain their lower bodies before their heads exploded. Human bitch. Give it, let's kill her together. Two second-order goblins who were in charge of protecting the first magic cannon rushed forward at the same time. Upon seeing the disaster Xietain was causing, they were the only ones who could somehow keep up with her and were not overwhelmed by the human girl's speed. After all, seeing the sword and spear of the two enemies slashing towards her, Xietain not only did not retreat but delightedly welcomed them by punching her two small fists forward. All enemies of my father have to die. The air shattered and the atmosphere trembled as Xietan's two fists advanced. By the time the two second-order goblins realized the danger they were facing, it was too late to retract their weapons, so they could only put more power into their weapons as well as more mana into their active skills. Boom! Boom! Two equally terrifying explosions swept through the surroundings at almost the same time. The sky rumbled and part of the wall shook so hard that some giant boulders broke off and fell freely towards the ground as the two shockwaves clashed in the center, causing a disaster that turned dozens of nearby goblins into a bloody mist. Ha 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 ha. Xietain laughed happily as she backed up a couple of steps after being hit by the shockwave of her own attack. Her black eyes sparkled with battle lust and bloodlust as she felt her soul power grow at astonishing speeds. She quickly reached over to the magic cannon and pulled out the third-order soul stone that fueled its power, before lunging forward, resuming her slaughter on the south wall with great pleasure. It seems that Xietain is a bit wild when it comes to fighting enemies. Oh well, as long as she doesn't forget to take the soul stones from the cannons, everything will be fine. Xietain muttered as he stood in the sky. On the ground, the army of about 50,000 goblins had disappeared and blood now flowed like a great river moving among the rocks with every shaking of the ground. Now, he watched as the 4 goblin airships surrounded him and the magic cannons lit up with a calm expression on his face. Although even he couldn't take those shots head-on since 2 were enough to wound him, 3 to severely wound him, and 4 enough to leave him on the verge of death. This was all in the hypothetical case of his body being hit. I'd better take care of this so I can play with the 3 goblins heading this way from the center of the base. Xietain scoffed as his eyes met those of one of the commanders through the airship glass. Xietain could take care of the unclassified, first-order, and second-order goblins with complete ease. It took a third-order goblin above level 120 to give her problems. The only thing Xietain feared was that the airships or magic cannons would target her, and precisely for that reason he sent her to the base wall. At the end of the day, Xietain was just a young girl who had just been born about 7 months ago without much combat experience, not to mention cunning. The magic cannons could not target the walls for obvious reasons, and he would be in charge of the airships. Xietain was treating the Mother Fortress, the most powerful fortress of the goblin race in northern Asia, as a training ground for his daughter. If his subordinates learned of this fact, they would probably be shocked beyond words, considering that they could only dream of destroying the enemy fortress unless the main leaders attacked all together at the same time. As for him, he would only kill the Third Order. 9 third-order soul evolvers left to complete the 100 of my advancement to the next stage. Chapter 944 Overwhelming and Terrifying Magic Power, Total Dominance. Xietain did not bother to stop the charge of the airship cannons. He wanted to see how powerful these weapons forged by the goblin race were, since his own faction had such cannons on the walls of some bases, but they had yet to be fired even once. They were in reserve for when a third-order enemy appeared. After all, one could not waste the energy of a valuable third-order soul stone on minor creatures. After all, these airships were slightly different from the airships he and Shangguan Bing Shui had faced months ago during the war against the goblin race that lasted for days without end. Boom. 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 2 or 3 seconds after the airships charged their energy beams, for simultaneous explosions shook the sky, and Xietan's eyes flashed as bright blue energy beams with purple flashing edges were captured in his pupils. Rumble. The sky rumbled and the air in the area heated up in seconds as the 4 energy beams collided at the same time, against 4 blood-red shields. The 4 energy beams did not disappear immediately, but the power of the cannons kept coming, increasing the size of each blue beam and causing the 4 blood shields to slowly shrink back, with large amounts of white smoke rising from the point of impact as the center. Standing on the 5th shield, Xietain calmly watched as his 4 shields were quickly drained away, and in a matter of a second, he came to the conclusion that while these cannons were capable of killing third-order evolvers, their penetrating power did not seem to be especially scary. The real terror was in the high temperature that could even melt his blood shields. He pointed his finger at one of the airships and said with indifference, "Blood chains." Swoosh. 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 The blood shield that Xietain was standing on became much smaller and thinner as dozens of thick, deep red chains shot out like tentacles, not only towards the airship he pointed his finger at, but also streaked across the sky towards the other 3 airships. Due to the hissing sound of the 4 laser beams hitting and weakening his blood shields, as well as the constant rumbling of the sky and the explosions of the battle on the fortress wall, Xietain could not hear what the goblins were saying, but he could see the panic in the creatures' eyes as they stepped forward to attack the blood chains that were not destroyed after being hit by the secondary weapons of each airship. Bone arrows charged with magic power, glowing lights released from the blades of the goblins, electric bolts and fireballs launched by the mages of the goblin race, and all sorts of attacks exploded from the 4 airships. However, to the surprise and horror of the First Order and Second Order goblins, the blood chains continued on their way despite having become a little thinner. Xietan's expression was indifferent as he waved a hand casually, and in response to his move, the blood chains coiled tightly around the 4 airships. After he had them where he wanted them, he clenched his fist tightly and in response, all the blood chains tightened viciously in an instant. The sound similar to a rock cracking gradually frightened the goblins inside the airships, and when they saw that things were not good they jumped at the immediate command of the second-order goblin leading them. Under the control of Xietain and his skill, blood manipulation, thin strands of blood peeled off the blood chains that clung to the airships. These blood threads snaked through the windows of each airship's control room, and using the advantage of his skill super warrior, which made Xietain an expert at controlling virtually any vehicle or war machine, he disabled the main cannons. Once the threat of the airship's cannons was deactivated, Xietain carefully controlled the blood chains to bring the heavy airships in his direction, while using his blood shields to block the incoming attacks of the still falling goblins. Xietain gently kicked the shield under his feet, and immediately afterward small but lethal crimson darts began to rain down in the direction of the more than 40 free-falling goblins. Bright arrow, burning blade, fireball. Those goblins with ranged attacks immediately responded by using all sorts of attacks to defend themselves, since they did not have any soul evolvers in possession of a barrier-type skill. At the end of the day, this type of skill was incredibly rare to fall into a skill scroll. Several of the darts were successfully shattered since they were so small that they could only contain a tiny amount of magic power and mana. However, the quantity was so large that it was simply impossible for the goblins to destroy them all. The second-order goblins slashed with their swords while moving their arms at lightning speed. Thanks to the agility of a second-order soul evolver, they managed to defend themselves. But the first-order goblins were not so lucky. Damn it! One of the goblin commanders cursed aloud as she watched the bodies of over 30 first-order goblins turn into seas with hundreds of tiny bloody holes piercing their bodies from side to side. It's pointless. Xietain whispered in a voice only he could hear. He pointed his finger downwards, and the second-order goblins did not have time to cry out in pain before the blood that stained their swords after destroying the darts turned into thin but extremely lethal threads that not only shattered the blades of their weapons but also curled around them and cut their bodies into dozens of pieces. Even without using overlap regeneration, Xietan's magic stat was over 2,000 points since he had gained possession of the collector's pocket watch. All that amount of magic points was comparable to that of a very talented soul evolver at the peak of the second order, or comparable to that of normal third-order soul evolvers over level 115. Once the goblin airships were close, Xietain moved for the first time since the battle began and jumped onto one of them. He sent the first airship into the collector's pocket world before jumping onto the second, then jumping onto the third, and finally onto the fourth before standing back up in the void. He naturally would not destroy such precious weapons of war capable of dominating the sky now that he had the overwhelming power to get them practically intact. Just at that moment, Xietan's expression changed, and with a lightning-fast movement, he pointed his open palm forward in the direction of the base walls. The 5 blood shields moved one in front of the other, covering Xietain behind just a moment before the magic cannonball fired from one of the cannons hit his body. Boom! Xietain frowned as his feet slid across the void. All 5 shields were torn apart by the magic cannon's attack, and the hand he was aiming forward with was shaken upwards due to the power of the explosion. As expected, the power of those things is horrifying. Even 5 blood shields powered by all my magic power can't take it completely. Xietain muttered under his breath as he stared coldly at the second-order goblin that had just fired the magic cannon and was now looking at him in shock when he saw his body intact. He pointed his index finger at that goblin who had taken advantage of the distance between him and Xietain to trigger the magic cannon and said coldly, "Fucking goblin, go to hell." The second-order goblin's pupils contracted fiercely, and the deep blue glow of a fire arrow was reflected in them. To his horror, he soon found that despite wanting to move, he was unable to do so, and because he was a melee warrior, he had no ranged skill to try to intercept the incoming attack before it hit him. The blue fire arrow struck his head without a sound, and in an instant, his body was engulfed in flames. Xietain let him writhe and howl in pain as his body was burned to ashes in seconds. "Father, I'm sorry," Xietain called out from the wall. The girl's expression was filled with remorse and fear. She could feel the terrifying power of that giant magic bullet, and her heart clenched as she imagined her beloved father being hit in the back because of her. Xietain looked at Xietain, whose dress was stained with blood, and shook his head as he waved his hand from the sky and removed those stains. "My dear Xietain, you don't have to apologize for anything. Just have fun and let father take care of the hard things." However, Xietain was stubborn. She shook her head furiously as she continued to slaughter the goblins on the wall and shouted out loud, "Crimson lightning flash!" Blood-red lightning crackled noisily around Xietan's body, and her face illuminated by the lightning was grim, as she said firmly, "Xietain is father's daughter. She will definitely be more useful from now on." Xietain shook his head as he saw Xietan's clones appearing around her and charging towards the other cannons, unleashing an even more ferocious one-sided massacre than before. It was around that time that more than 200 airships appeared in the sky from a distance. Moreover, Xietain could sense that apart from the millions of goblins that were already there but kept exploding one after another under the power of his skill, blood manipulation, there were also powerful auras very close to the walls. "Xietain, I'll leave this part to you, okay? Father will go take care of the older bad guys since I'm the adult after all." "Okay." "Xietain will take care of the little ones since I'm still this young." She really accepted that explanation. Xietain didn't stop and kicked the air step under his feet, launching himself at lightning speed towards the incoming airships. Those weapons were too dangerous. Xietain certainly wouldn't survive if she was hit by 2 or 3 magic beams, even if she had an impressively strong body. Boom. 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 From the other walls, terrifying explosions sounded, and Xietain immediately judged that the magic cannons were firing at him, taking advantage of the fact that he was in the sky within firing range. However, Xietan's speed was truly frightening. The large and powerful magic cannonballs flew past his body, but none of them managed to hit him. Therefore, and after flying several thousand meters, they finally fell into the city, causing a huge disaster that destroyed buildings and crushed lives in the process. At the same time, more than 20 relatively close airships opened fire, firing the main cannon immediately. Range, about 2,000 meters. Xietain said to himself as he waved his right hand. From his liquid storage pearl, great torrents of blood shot forward, and in less than a second the sky seemed to turn into a bloody sea. Just before the more than 20 bright blue laser beams with purple flashes hit, the sea of blood transformed into a huge deep red wall that seemed to separate the world in two. Bang! 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 Followed by multiple impact explosions. Xietain could smell the odor of burning blood and hear the hissing on the other side of the wall. It wasn't long before the other airships fired their main cannons, followed by the attacks of the goblins on board. At the same time, the magic cannons on the walls that Xietain had not yet reached opened fire again not long after. Xietain waved both hands outward and more blood came out of his storage pearl. Blood which under the power of his skill, blood manipulation, turned into hundreds of sturdy shields that floated around him like stars revolving around the moon. Boom! 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 A dozen shields were shattered and the sky rumbled as if the end of the world was near. However, despite the terrifying power that the goblin race was showing to have, Xietain kept his cool. At the same time as he replaced the blood shields with others, he gently placed his hand on his side of the blood wall that served as a separator between this side and the side of the airships as he said in a cold voice, "Blood chains." Chapter 945 Fall of the Fortress Mother and an Irrational Father. If it were Xietain before getting the collector's pocket watch, then he certainly would not have the ability to do all this. Rather than lack of ability, the problem would be the lack of mana, which would force Xietain to activate overlap regeneration to refuel his reserves at least one time. However, after obtaining the demigod-grade treasure that increased his mana by 1,000 points, doubling his reserves in an instant, Xietain had enough mana to use his skills with far greater freedom, compared to the past. Swoosh. 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 Dozens became hundreds, and those hundreds soon became thousands. The goblins operating the airships were frightened when they saw that from the blood-red wall rising up to the sky, sturdy chains of blood were detached. These blood chains appeared to be dragons, writhing as they sped towards each of the nearest airships or past those that had already been caught to catch, those further back in the line. Except for the chains that were hit by the laser beams fired from the main cannons of each airship, the other chains held their ground even after being hit by numerous attacks from the secondary weapons of each ship as well as some active skills launched by the goblins. Shit, watch out. Sir, oh heck, the airship is being crushed by those things. Fuck, it's going to explode with us inside at this rate. Jump. The goblins began to panic as the blood chains coiled like snakes around the airships, causing the structure of most of the ships to deform slightly once the blood chains glowed and squeezed tightly. Swoosh. Xietain waved a hand and a hole large enough for him to pass through formed in the wall of blood before him. His agility rose mightily as he activated Crimson Lightning Flash, and at the same time as dozens of deep red lightning flashes crackled noisily around his body, Xietain stomped the air step under his feet and turned into a human lightning bolt straight towards the nearest airship. Human shit, don't be so cocky. About 200 second-order goblins used the chains to their advantage instead of jumping to the ground. They jumped down from the airships they controlled and ran through the thick chains that were connected to the blood wall to close the distance between them and the hateful human who was causing such a mess in their fortress. Unfortunately or not, Xietain did not even bother to look at these goblins, but simply waved a hand forward as he said in a cold voice, blood absorption. The second-order goblins were startled when suddenly their feet froze, and when they looked down they saw the chains of blood glowing brightly. Just before the first could ask what was happening, howls of pain escaped from the mouths of some of the goblins, and in just 2 seconds they were all shrieking as they felt all the blood in their bodies being rapidly drained out of their bodies going downward. In about a minute, the 200 second-order goblins became a pile of skin and bones falling from the sky, when the blood chains, now more robust and powerful than before, ceased to hold them steady. As for Xietain, he had already managed to catch 43 airships that had been sent to the Collector's Pocket world, while killing 70% of the first-order goblins on the ground after they jumped out of the airships. Those cannons are really a pain in the ass, he said in a grim voice as he hurriedly covered the left side of his body with 7 robust blood shields positioned in a straight line, one in front of the other. Boom! After a powerful explosion followed by a terrifying shockwave, 6 of the 7 blood shields were shattered and the blood was vaporized, while the 7th one was filled with cracks and lost 60% of its defensive power. However, these shields fulfilled their function since Xietain was not affected at all. Even so, this event reaffirmed the power of the magic cannons installed on the walls of the goblin base. After about 3 or 4 minutes, the approximately 200 airships were effectively captured by Xietain. With these powerful aerial weapons, his faction could form a new division specialized in heavy assault against enemy bases or scouting dangerous areas. It was around this time that the magic explosions from the walls began to become fewer and fewer in number and less continuous than before. A minute later, and as tens of thousands of blood swords rained down from the sky, slaughtering tens of thousands of unclassified and first-order goblins per second, the explosions from the walls finally ceased completely. Xietain looked back as he silently activated overlap regeneration and replenished his practically drained mana. After the use of such devastating attacks and the creation of so many strong blood shields, his blood-red eyes met the shining black eyes of Xietain, who was panting softly but had a bright smile on her lovely sweet face. Father, Xietain has taken all the soul stones from the cannons on the wall. Xietain caressed the hair of the girl who with a leap stepped into his embrace in search of warmth. Seeing Xietain's expectant look as she looked at him as if she was waiting for something, Xietain couldn't help but chuckle. He gently kissed her forehead and said softly, "Thank you for helping Father, Xietain. I couldn't have done it this easily without you." He was not lying. If not for Xietain's strength being so overwhelming, which allowed Xietain to focus on other things and leave the magic cannons to her, he could not have entered this fortress so easily and might even have had to destroy everything, something he did not want since it would be a great waste to lose all this technology and the construction of a great base like this. Hee. Xietain was delighted and her hug around him tightened after being praised. She greatly admired her second mother as she was so beautiful and powerful. Xietain did not know how powerful her third mother was, but since even with her passive that allowed her to know the level of anyone below or in her same order and Xietain still could not read it, she could say that her mother Lilith had a high level. However, the one she admired the most of all was her father. Xietain's eyes sparkled as she looked at the serene expression and cold eyes of her beloved father. As she listened to the wind howling around her, followed by loud explosions every time a blood sword rained down from the sky to end the life of at least one enemy, she felt a great desire to follow him to be more like him. Xietain felt Xietain squirm a little in his arms, and when he looked at her he was slightly surprised to see her raising her right hand towards the sky. Ice swords. Xietain looked up at the sky just in time to see the air cool and the particles merge together, quickly forming approximately 2,000 beautiful silver swords. Right. Xietain learned the skill ice maker from Bing Shui's records when she was born. He had forgotten this fact since up until now all Xietain had been doing was punching with her fists or throwing kicks. The silver ice swords joined the crimson blood swords, increasing the speed at which the goblins were slaughtered by no small margin. "Xietain, are you all right? Don't push yourself too hard, you don't need to," Xietain said as he saw her slightly pale face. "Xietain is well. Xietain is Father's daughter after all," she replied quietly as her chest rose and fell. Xietain watched her silently, watching as a bead of sweat slid silently from the girl's forehead. He closed his eyes for a moment, but whatever he was thinking he didn't say. He silently activated gravity manipulation at the same time as the air step that held them in the sky disappeared. Soon, Xietan's body and Xietain's body still in his arms began to slowly descend until the two finally stopped at the top of a large building made of white stones. Seconds later, 3 terrifying auras caused the atmosphere to shudder. Xietan's eyes were indifferent as he stared coldly at the 3 goblins who with a boom soared over 200 meters in an instant, stopping at 3 buildings 300 meters in front of the building where Xietain and Xietain were standing. "Who the hell are you two?" a violet-skinned, green-eyed goblin asked. His voice was deep, his body was as thick as a tree trunk, standing over 2 meters tall, and he carried a large black club in his hands. From the way he looked at Xietain and Xietain, it was clear that this goblin was not underestimating them. In fact, the other 2 goblins were the same. Seeing how a human male with a female had managed to break through the defenses of the mother fortress so easily, in a matter of minutes, only a raving madman would underestimate them. Due to the massive size of the base, even for them that were third-order goblins, it would require several minutes of pushing themselves to the limit if they wanted to urgently reach any of the entrances. However, they were not so worried at first as they did not believe that anyone could take down the mother fortress even with a month of effort, not to mention a few minutes. Therefore, when the 3 third-order goblins saw how at least 1/5 of the total number of soldiers had disappeared along with the bigger air fleet next to the deactivation of the magic cannons installed on top of the walls, the surprise and disbelief they felt in their hearts were not small at all. "Where's your leader?" Xietain asked, directly ignoring the question of the goblin in front of him. Although he was slightly surprised that these goblins were above level 140, that was all, slightly surprised. In his eyes, only soul evolvers with extremely pure soul power on par with Shangguan Bing Shui, Bai Shilin, Liam, or the Demon Lord were worthy of paying attention to. Between levels 100 and 200, the rest were just junk. Of course, Bai Zemin did not get the response he was looking for. The personality of the goblins was never pleasant to begin with. They were all fierce and lustful by nature, with wild blood coursing through their veins. Bai Zemin had already managed to infuriate them with the chaos he had caused in their realm, and Bai Shilin's beauty was getting on their nerves a bit. The fact that he treated them like air and spoke in an authoritative tone finished pouring the water out of the glass that was already on the verge of collapsing. "You piece of human shit. How dare you?" A spear-wielding goblin took a step forward while cursing. Furthermore, the dark green shimmer on his spear signaled the activation of an attack skill. However, the goblin's pupils contracted fiercely when he saw the human female next to the male disappearing, followed by an explosion in the distant building. Out of pure battle instinct rooted in his body, the third-order goblin raised his spear to head height in a defensive stance. Boom! Luiz. The other two goblins looked on in shock and fury as the spear-wielding third-order goblin, whose name was Luiz, flew backwards, smashing two entire buildings in the process and being buried under a pile of rubble and dust. "This bitch." Fury converged with lust in the hearts of the two goblins as they watched Bai Shilin slowly retract her fist. She was standing right where the goblin named Luiz had been standing just a moment ago. Bai Shilin's body was enveloped by a halo of silver light, a sign that the girl was using her skill overlap strength, which allowed her to take 50% of any one stat except health and convert those points into strength points. Shilin will not allow anyone to curse her father. Her youthful face was very serious as she looked at the goblin named Luiz slowly crawling out of the rubble. Although the goblin was without visible wounds, the trembling in both arms was obvious to everyone, and his spear had split into two halves after taking Bai Shilin's fist. "If you do that again, Shilin will kill you," she said in a gentle but serious voice. Seeing Bai Shilin acting this serious, and this being the first time she heard her being so firm about something, Lilith didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she said softly, "Is she your little guardian or what?" "Of course," Bai Zemin said proudly. "She's Daddy's little girl after all." Lilith looked at him with a dead expression on her face and growled mildly, "You really are a pervert. Couldn't it be that the pervert is you for thinking bad things of my words?" Bai Zemin casually dismissed it. "We'll see when little Shilin gets herself a boyfriend," Lilith said with a snort. "Boyfriend?" Bai Zemin looked at her and said in a deep voice, "Shilin will never get a boyfriend. I'll kill them all if it ever happens." "You?" Lilith was dumbfounded at the seriousness on his face before bursting out laughing. How irrational could this man be? Lilith actually found it very funny. To Bai Zemin, all this was no big deal. He looked at the three third-order goblins and took a step forward as his cold voice spread all around. "Since you don't want to tell me who your leader is, and this one doesn't come out to greet me, then you can all go to hell." Bai Zemin had no plans to leave these third-order goblins alive and make them his subordinates or anything similar. These three goblins could have participated in Zhongda's death somehow, not to mention that Bai Zemin needed them dead anyway. The death of the three was written in stone, and with it the fall of the strongest fortress of the goblin race. Chapter 946, Third Prince, Two Old Acquaintances. The Central Plains of Inner Mongolia, a vast expanse of land that was part of what was once known as China to the world, was a very snowy area with temperatures usually low during most part of the year, with winter obviously being its lowest point. Being the largest boundary between the territory of China and Russia, one could get a better idea of how cold this area was. This was especially true after the Soul record arrived on Earth. Temperatures were so low that the lakes had become congealed ice rinks. The small rivers hardly had any life apart from a few fish moving under a thin layer of ice, and the plants capable of surviving such extreme weather during practically 365 days of the year were the strongest, while the weakest had no chance of growing at all. In the north of the Central Plains, a large human base with sturdy 500-meter-high walls stretched for more than 50,000 meters across its length and breadth. Although 50,000 meters might sound like a lot, the reality was that seen from the sky, the base looked small and desolate in the midst of so much seemingly lifeless white. This base was the largest and most powerful human base in all of Inner Mongolia. Of course, its size and defensive power were incomparable when placed side by side with a monster like the mother fortress of the goblin race that they had worked for more than 8 months to build up from the ground. It was more than clear at a glance that the leaders or the leader of this base were equal to the goblin race when it came to designing. Unlike the transcendent faction bases that, thanks to the continuous recruitment of talent not only in warfare, but also in design and construction, possessed houses whose architecture was in keeping with the past, the houses and facilities of this base were very rustic and simple, with no flashy luxuries. Inside a large 2-story house whose construction had been more carefully planned compared to the others, a small private meeting was taking place in a spacious living room. The interior of the room was warm, the fireplace was lit, and the warmth of the flames burning the wood was kept inside thanks to the fact that the doors and windows were closed. In addition, the crackling of the wood slowly being consumed by the fire added an extra layer of heartwarming moral support. I have already told you what my price is. If you want food, then give me 10 battle tanks, 5 assault helicopters, 20,000 rifles, 300,000 rounds of ammunition, plus 20 beautiful virgins. Sitting on a couch covered with the fur of a white bear, a handsome young man who appeared to be between 24 and 25 years old smiled slightly as he looked at the person sitting on the opposite couch. This smiling man was certainly not human, but there were not many differences except for his slightly longer and pointier ears or the blue scale in the center of his forehead. Furthermore, the 2 Triton men wearing plate armor and carrying spears standing behind him exposed his identity as a member of the sea race, and judging by the third order aura escaping from the bodies of these 2 bodyguards, this man's identity was certainly not a minor role. On the opposite couch, the expression of the burly, bearded man was not good as he looked at the smiling young man. Despite looking much younger compared to 10 months ago, whether it was by Zemin, Shangguan Bing Shui, Kai Jingyi, Kong Lan, Chen He, Fu Xiefeng, as well as any other surviving students or professors of Beijing University would certainly be able to identify this person. This may be a big price to pay for you, but understand that the food we are talking about here are my subordinates. The young man had no change in his smiling expression despite his words. I think you can understand that I too am in a situation of dilemma, human leader Liangpeng. Right. This person was none other than Liangpeng, one of the 4 pillars that fought in Beijing University to open a blood path to the exit together with Bai Zemin, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Chen He. Liangpeng's courage, stubbornness, the sheer amount of effort, and talent were certainly top-notch when it came to evolving. Despite all the difficulties that had come his way, he had not only survived but had also managed to set foot firmly in this land by receiving a great boost of power after receiving a subclass and titles that identified him as the lord and master of this territory. However, Liangpeng was having 2 big problems at the moment, and these 2 problems were practically keeping him awake at night. First and foremost, the most urgent problem, food problem. Because crops were extremely difficult to maintain, it was practically impossible to keep a population of over 400,000 humans eating purely vegetables, not only because of the limited quantity, but there was also the problem of the climate. Meat protein was needed to get the normal humans through the cruel winter. Liangpeng might as well go out or send a team to hunt mutant beasts, which he did in the past. However, hunting large numbers of mutant beasts was now out of the question because the person in front of him was in an alliance with the leader of the beasts in this area. Therefore, unless Liangpeng was willing to break his alliance with the sea race, this option was completely beyond consideration. It was precisely at this point that the second problem came in, the source of the first problem, as well as all the problems Liangpeng faced. He clenched his fists, and a flash of hatred and anger shone in his eyes as he looked at the glass table in front of him as if he wanted to smash it right there and then. It's all because of that little bitch Shangguan Bing Shui. If that slut hadn't cut my way south, the food problem wouldn't be a problem. Damn it. Liang Peng could barely keep his sanity as his whole body trembled. The young man watched everything with a faint smile as a glint of amusement shone in his blue eyes. He was the fourth prince of the sea race that populated the Eastern Sea, and thanks to certain events in the past, he was now the prince with the best chance of sitting on the throne of the next king of his people. His name was Xietain, and he was not only a powerful third-order soul evolver in his own right but also had a huge army that was not lacking in powerhouses. Xietain would originally disdain old-fashioned human weaponry, however, if he wanted to settle his feet firmly on the earth he needed such weaponry and technology. After all, the power of his people was greatly weakened out of the water. Therefore, he was taking advantage of his allies' difficulties to gain personal advantages. Liang Peng could not go and hunt sea creatures as that would mean breaking the alliance, something he did not favor, or he could go and hunt sea creatures to the south, but that was out of the question, unless he had the power to annihilate the enemy human camp. Liang Peng was literally against the ropes with no escape route. He could not hunt large numbers of mutant beasts. He could not hunt sea creatures, because if the fourth prince found out, he would not only break the alliance they had, but could also end up being the spark that started a huge explosion. The crops were not growing in sufficient quantities. With no other choice, Liang Peng finally nodded, understood. I accept your terms, Prince Xietain. It is my pleasure to do dealings with you. Xietain smiled kindly and said in a gentle voice, then, I will have my people hand over 100,000 tons of meat for you. The expression on Liang Peng's face got a little better when he heard this. That amount of food would certainly help for 2 or 3 months before signs of problem reappeared. However, Liang Peng knew he needed to find a solution soon. He had already given up a lot of resources to the Russians for heavy weaponry and was now using that weaponry to obtain food from the sea race. At this rate, Liang Peng knew that in a short time he would end up losing everything. Thinking about this, Liang Peng looked at the other existence sitting on the third single couch that had remained silent all this time. This existence was a goblin, a powerful goblin. His skin was blue and beside him was a green sword. Nothing about him was extremely eye-catching. However, if Bai Zemin were to meet this goblin, he would be able to identify him as that second-order goblin, whose life he spared to deal with the at that time unknown effect of the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath that appeared and got triggered after Geminder threatened his family. The fourth prince of the Eastern Sea Marine race smiled slightly as he saw that his role in this place was finished. In that case, Goblin Leader Crare, Human Leader Liang Peng, I will retire for now. I need to prepare my army for. Xietain had only just stood up when his words were interrupted by the sound of something cracking. Both Xietain and Liang Peng looked at Crare, whose expression went from normal to shock before turning to anger as he watched the 3 crystal pearls hanging at his waist turning into dust. Impossible! Crare jumped to his feet and roared so loudly that the entire house shook fiercely. The 2 Triton bodyguards of Xietain stepped forward as they watched Crare with caution. Liang Peng was no different as he could feel the goblin's terrifying aura getting out of control. Crare ignored the reaction of everyone and with a furious expression picked up the crushed glass from the 3 broken pearls. He threw the broken glass into the air and said furiously, projection. The 3 pearls were actually treasures with 2 different functions. One was to put a seal or mark in the soul of a living being, which would give the owner of the pearls the ability to end the life of that living being by simply injecting their mana and breaking the pearls. Of course, if those with the seal or mark were killed or died, the 3 pearls would be destroyed as had just happened. As for the other function, when Crare shouted the word projection, the crystals hovered in the air and glowed. The crystals formed 4 groups and moved so that soon a rectangle similar to a giant screen was formed and, under the stupefied gaze of Xietain and Liang Peng, the last 5 seconds before the death of the 3 goblins that Crare had marked to keep under control were projected to be shown in front of them. All they saw was blood, lots of blood. Collapsed buildings, blood swords slaughtering goblins, and finally, The 3/3 order goblins that held control in the mother fortress lying buried deep in the ground as they groaned in pain. However, the next thing they saw caused both Claire and Liangpeng to have drastic changes on their faces, and Xian Kuan certainly did not miss this fact. A man wearing a full set of plate armor and matching deep red gauntlets approached the edge of the crater with a young silver-haired human beauty who had a proud smile on her little face. The human male's eyes were as red as those of a demon and his gaze as indifferent as that of an emotionless machine. Although the image had no sound, those present had no difficulty reading his lips as he uttered the word die while pointing his finger at the 3/3 order goblins. Bang! Immediately after that, the crystal pieces turned into particles of light that disappeared without a trace after floating in the air for 2 or 3 seconds, signaling the end of the lives of the 3 powerful goblins and thus ending the projection. Chapter 947 Cruelty. Xian Kuan silently watched the expressions on Claire and Liangpeng's frozen faces for a few seconds before finally narrowing his eyes and deciding to break the spell of silence that seemed to have descended upon the world. I can tell by the expression on your faces that you two definitely know those 2 humans. The 4th Prince Xian Kuan's voice was soft and calm, like that of an adult speaking to 2 frightened children. Shit. That son of a bitch really didn't die. Liangpeng finally took out all the anger and frustration he had been holding back, destroying the table in front of him with a kick that turned every shard of glass into dust. Xian Kuan finally couldn't help but frown as he asked, still keeping the faint smile on his no longer soft face. Human leader Liangpeng, if you don't explain the situation to me, I'm afraid we might have an internal problem. From now on, everything that was happening was a very important process for the 4th Prince of the Sea race. If his plan succeeded, he would not only soon become the king of the East Sea but also conquer a vast expanse of land with hundreds of thousands and even millions of humans at his disposal, which he would later use to attack other sea areas and expand his territory and dominance. Therefore, Xian Kuan would not allow variables. He would eliminate them by any means necessary and using whatever methods had to be used. Pride? Honor? Although Xian Kuan was a prince, none of this mattered when it came to the battlefield. This was survival of the fittest, where the strongest and smartest devoured the weakest and dumbest. Simple as that. Liangpeng was in no mood to listen to Xian Kuan, nor was he intimidated by that hidden threat. He knew that Xian Kuan needed him and his faction, otherwise he wouldn't be in this room having a comfortable chat with everyone. Hey, Claire! What the hell was that just now? Liangpeng looked at the goblin leader, whose body was shaking with a rabid expression on his face, and shouted. Claire's eyes were bloodshot as he slowly explained what had just happened, as well as the function of the treasure. Finally, he destroyed the armchair he had been sitting on all this time and said angrily, By Zeman, that disgusting human was not content with the south, but now he is aiming for the north as well. He was more than raging, he was simply mad with anger. Even though the mother fortress was only one of the many bases Claire controlled in this area, it was the strongest and most important fortress of his goblin race. Besides, with the fall of the mother fortress, the human troops would be a lot freer to advance towards Inner Mongolia. The loss Claire had just experienced was simply immense. Xian Kuan slowly sat down after listening to the goblin leader's explanation with a thoughtful expression on his face. Although that faint smile was still on his face, the coldness in his gaze turned it into a slightly murderous smile. After a minute or two, Liangpeng muttered in confusion, Who was that brat? She looked like Shangguan Bing Shui, but she is definitely not. Besides, for Bai Zemin to take her to the battlefield against 3/3 order soul evolvers, it's highly probable that the strength of that little girl is not small. Despite his appearance, Liangpeng was certainly very intelligent, enough to deduce a thing or two with the little information he currently had. One meeting had ended, but another began to take place immediately. With these 3 adding to the count, there are only 6 more left. Bai Zemin had no idea that his arrival in Inner Mongolia was already exposed to the enemy. However, even if he did know, it was unlikely that he would care, let alone worry. If he wanted to remain anonymous, then he would not have charged into the mother fortress as soon as he arrived, and caused such a huge stir. "Father, what do we do now?" Bai Sherlin looked at him with shining eyes. The long-ago big girl's admiration and respect for her father had reached supreme levels this time. Bai Sherlin was so powerful that despite being at level 94 after killing so many enemies in this battle that she could fight third-order soul evolvers without inconvenience. However, she certainly could not kill 3 goblins above level 140 fighting alone against all 3 at the same time. At the end of the day, Bai Sherlin lacked real combat experience and cunning. She simply overwhelmed her enemies from the start, so she never learned practically anything from them, unlike Bai Zemin and the others who gradually grew with their lives on the line. But seeing Bai Zemin literally overwhelm with such ease 3 soul evolvers that even Bai Sherlin was a little afraid of made the innocent and pure-hearted girl feel that she had found her path to follow in life. Bai Zemin searched the heads of the 3 goblins for soul stones and felt regret when he found none. He sent their bodies directly to his storage ring, as in it the bodies and food would not go bad, unlike letting them loose in the collector's pocket world. One of the reasons Bai Zemin was unwilling to part with his precious ring. "Let's finish off all the goblins first," he said as he stood up and looked at the seemingly endless sea of goblins that still continued to attack despite seeing 3 of their most powerful leaders slaughtered. "Later on we're going to go for a walk around the base." "Okay." Wiping out so many millions of goblins was no easy task, but it wasn't difficult relatively speaking either. Bai Zemin did not dare to use the power of the endless blue lotus flame here. Although the distinctive feature of his blue flame would have made things infinitely easier, since the endless blue lotus flame only needed a little mana to theoretically extend to infinity. Bai Zemin could not control everything to decide what was burned and what was not. To reach such a perfect realm required years of training, time that he currently did not have. Bai Sherlin, making use of her ice maker skill, slowly began to become more adept in the use of magic, thus slowly opening a much bigger door for her aside from her terrifying physical attack power and inhuman endurance. With her as support, Bai Zemin roamed all the streets of the base, activating blood manipulation at all times. The goblins writhed in pain and howled at the sky for an instant before swelling up like balloons and exploding into a lot of bloody mist that under Bai Zemin's control became a lethal weapon, spreading throughout the base, entering the lungs of the farthest goblins, and turning into blades that ended their lives from the inside. Approximately 5 hours later, Bai Zemin and Bai Sherlin finally managed to wipe out the more than 10 million goblins after much searching and labor. However, he was generous this time. "Phew." Bai Sherlin wiped the sweat from her forehead and said with surprise written all over her small face, "Father, those little green monsters really are numerous, aren't they?" "Well, most goblins don't have great physical power, nor are they particularly genius when it comes to magic, but their numbers certainly are terrifying." Bai Zemin nodded as he walked through the bloodied streets of the fallen fortress. "I see." Bai Sherlin nodded as she followed him, taking his hand. She looked at him with shining eyes and said cheerfully, "But no matter how many come, those little green monsters are nothing compared to Father." Bai Zemin ruffled the girl's hair a little with a smile on his face before continuing on his way. "Father, why don't you kill these goblins?" Bai Sherlin asked curiously as she glanced over her shoulder and looked at the little goblins following them with their heads down. Bai Zemin looked back for a moment before turning his head forward. "These goblins have just been born and haven't had time to do anything wrong after all. We'll see if we can turn them into our army later." "I see." Bai Sherlin nodded, understanding but not understanding at the same time. Due to such a huge difference in levels, Bai Zemin didn't get as many skill scrolls or treasures compared to that time when he and his team were underground fighting for days against the Weaver ant colony. However, he and Bai Sherlin still managed to obtain around 30 treasure orbs, of which 25 were red color normal grade, 4 were orange color rare grade, and finally 1 was yellow color magic grade. The magic grade treasure was a medallion that increased stealth by 15% in addition to granting stats and having an attached active skill that increased stealth by another 15% for 5 minutes. This was undoubtedly a great treasure, but Xietain had no temporary use for it. Still, he decided to save it for future uses as he didn't know what kind of situations he would run into. After walking for about 10 minutes, Xietain stopped and half-closed his eyes as he sensed about 5 auras inside a building. "Sherlyn, wait here," he said in a serious voice. Sherlyn wanted to say something, but in the end ended up nodding as she saw the serious expression on her father's face. "Okay." Xietain stared at the building before walking towards it. However, when he opened the door and the rotten smell from inside hit his face, Xietain felt his stomach churn even though he was used to the smell of blood and intestines given his fighting style. Even though he knew he might encounter something like this, when Xietain saw the scene inside the small building, he felt a surge of anger so strong that it threatened to drive him to madness. As if they were cattle, bodies of men and women alike hung from hooks falling from the ceiling. Heads with extruded eyes and no noses or peeled lips, half-eaten limbs, internal organs, layers of skin. The sight was at least 1,000 times worse than the smell of rotting flesh. There were young women, adult women, there were old people, there were small children, and even the fetus of what appeared to be a baby taken from its mother's womb before birth. Xietain gritted his teeth so hard that from inside his mouth blood began to spurt out like crazy, but his red eyes were wide open as he looked at the scene in front of him as if he wanted to engrave it deeply into his heart. "Since you have no mercy even towards children, then don't blame me for being cruel from now on." Sherlyn was startled and her beautiful face turned slightly pale when she saw her father's practically distorted expression as he turned to look at the small goblins behind her. However, she didn't have time to say anything. "Die." Her voice was not different from a roar. The nearest buildings shook and the atmosphere trembled. The shockwave of his roar was enough to explode the bodies of over 200 newborn goblins, and that blood became the final executioner that ended the lives of thousands more. The baby goblins cried out in pain with their bodies cut in half, while the luckiest of them were directly killed, after being cut into countless pieces. Sherlyn looked back with a bit of fear, but when she turned her face to the front and saw the expression of anger and pain on her father's face, all that fear turned to worry. She was a very sensible girl, so instead of asking questions she just stood obediently with a sad expression on her face. "You, human." Xietain clenched his fists as he heard a voice hoarse but as weak as a newborn cat's meow from inside hell at his back. It took everything from him not to leave the place. He walked into the house and closed the door so as not to let Sherlyn see anything inside, and when he approached the deepest part he found the only 5 living beings that were in the house beside him. However, despite being alive, the sight of them was not much better than the dead people hanging there. All 5 were women, but they were no longer whole. One of them had had her legs torn off, one had had an eye and an arm taken off, one had all her fingers cut off, one had had her ears and a leg torn off, and one had lost her left eye as well as her left arm and leg. Far from feeling disgusted at the sight of the white and yellow maggots writhing in the rotting flesh of the wounds, what Xietain felt was anger and hatred towards the goblin race. "Please, se." It was the same voice as before, and it came from the woman whose fingers were missing. Xietain met a beautiful pair of brown eyes that despite having lost all light looked at him pleadingly, as to what it was that she was begging for. Xietain knew without having to hear anything. Chapter 948, a 5 months late meeting. Even if Xietain had the skill blood manipulation, even if Kong Lan were present, all the 2 of them would be able to do was keep these 5 women alive, but the eyes, limbs, and whatever parts were ripped from their bodies could not be recovered. However, all of this was the least important issue. The real problem was in the hearts and memories of the 5 women. The thick yellowish liquid stuck on their naked bodies exposed that all 5 had been assaulted by who knows how many goblins for who knows how long, and given that the goblin sense of beauty was no different from that of humans, it was not hard to assume that all 5 women had once been beauties in their own right. Raped, tortured, humiliated, stripped of their appearance, and who knows how many other torments. Xietain didn't need to be a genius to know that none of them had the will to live. He never cried for strangers. Xietain always felt that none of that was of any importance to him. The life or death of others depended on others, and he only had to take care of those he cared about. He wasn't wrong, however. For the first time he had to try hard not to cry, not only from sadness, but also from anger and powerlessness. How old were these women? Xietain could tell, by the somewhat dirty face of the girl whose fingers were missing, that she was not much older than Callie. Amidst the rancid smell, Xietain could suddenly smell a sweet scent of rose, and a second later felt the presence as well as the embrace of the woman he loved most in this world. Always keep in mind that none of this is your fault. Xietain, you are not a god. Even I couldn't do anything to help here, even with all my powers unleashed. Lilith whispered. Xietain knew it, he was clear about it. He was not a god, he was far from it. But, this feeling of impotence again. He said hoarsely through his teeth. I feel that same powerlessness again that I felt when I couldn't go straight to my family or when Zhongda died. This hateful feeling that won't let me sleep keeps eating into my heart every day. Lilith stayed silent and simply let him know that he was not alone. It was hard for her to say words in this kind of circumstance. Xietain was so powerful that he wasn't used to things getting out of hand, and for better or worse, all he had lost so far was a friend. In contrast to Lilith or many others who had experienced the greatest loss a living being could suffer, Xietain was indeed still well, which made it difficult for him to understand some things. For example, it was hard for him to accept the feeling of impotence that even now, despite being so powerful and having lived for so many years, Lilith burdened her heart with. Xietain looked at the 5 women in front of him and said in a low, hoarse voice, I have killed all the goblins in this base, and I will kill all the goblins until there are none left. You can rest in peace now. He didn't know if it was wishful thinking on his part, maybe he was simply looking for some relief for himself. But for an instant, Xietain thought he saw a glint of gratitude appear in the eyes of the girl who looked to be no more than 15 years old. Thank you. That was all the only girl with the ability to speak and stay conscious could say before her heart stopped beating. Xietain had used blood manipulation to stop the hearts of the 5 and give them a quick, and hopefully, painless death. Feeling the blue flame spreading outward from Xietan's body, the automatic protection of Lilith's combat dress activated and a faint layer of mana surrounded her body. Although the power of the endless blue lotus flame alone was insufficient to cause her any damage in the short term, it would still cause some pain considering it was not just any flame. On the outside at least, Xietain regained his composure as he calmly walked out of the building consumed by blue flames. The flames served to wash away sins, impurities, and this was one of the reasons why they were used in the past to cremate the bodies of important figures such as kings and emperors. Father. Xietain looked at him still worried and teary-eyed. Xietain tried to smile as naturally as possible as he took the little girl in his arms. My little Xietain, you have no need to worry. Father is fine. Xietain said nothing and let herself be hugged as she silently hugged him back. By the way, have you gotten bigger or am I seeing things? Xietain is a big girl. Of course, Xietain is a supergirl. About 4 hours passed since Xietain contacted the only base his faction had in this part of the country. He was standing high on the southern wall as he gazed into the distance with lost eyes, occasionally exchanging words with Xietain in order not to worry the girl. It was around that time when the sound of engines coming from the distance began to become clearer and clearer. Xietain moved his head slightly more to the west and saw a fleet of modified vehicles advancing towards the Mother Fortress under the protection of more than 100 military vehicles. 2 fighter jets approached quickly from a distance, and Xietain raised his head slightly as they passed above him. They were probably sent to do recon and scan the area. Leader Bai, you're finally back. Big brother, welcome home. Xietain lowered his head slightly, and in front of him now stood a small group of people looking at him with different emotions. However, they all shared that genuine joy that could not be faked when they looked at him. Fu Xiefeng, Nangong Yi, Nangong Lingxin, Luo Ning. They had all become powerful soul evolvers, more than they already were in the past. Still feeling his heart heavy, Bai Zemin looked at them silently one by one. Fu Xiefeng and Nangong Lingxin were already in the third order, surpassing level 120. Nangong Yi was somewhere below level 120. Luo Ning was level 100, so she would soon become a third-order soul evolver in her own right. It was finally then when he said in a low voice, "All of you have become stronger. It's good to see you all again." These people had been there for him practically from the beginning, and after all the things Bai Zemin had experienced and seen, he finally began to appreciate them as they deserved to be appreciated. Unbeknownst to him, he was slowly taking his first steps towards the completion of one of the evolutionary requirements of the passive skill Immovable Heart. "And you're still in the first order as always, aren't you?" joked Nangong Lingxin. "First order forever." Bai Zemin played along as he looked at her silently. Nangong Lingxin was already beautiful, but now she was even more gorgeous. Her beauty was such that in their faction only Shangguan Bing Shui, Wu Yijuan, Shangguan Xingyue, and Sun Ling could surpass her. She was on par with the American soul evolver Eleanor in terms of appearance and body, but Nangong Lingxin looked at his red eyes before looking him up and down and saying with a faint smile, "You've become more handsome even though your appearance hasn't changed much." How to describe it? Your aura? I think that's it. You seem more mature than before. Bai Zemin simply tried to smile in response and said nothing. At the end of the day, illusion or not, he had lived 10,000 years. Sealed memories and all, on a subconscious level there would certainly be changes. Leader, Zhongde. Fu Xiefeng clenched his fists to the point where his palms began to bleed as he kept his head down. "I know," Bai Zemin said. "We will take vengeance for his death, and eventually bring him back after gathering his records." "That's how it should be." They exchanged glances before looking at Bai Zemin with confidence. "That's how it should be." Nangong Yi nodded firmly. Bai Zemin smiled slightly at Luo Ning, who was looking at him a little reservedly. The girl had certainly matured a lot compared to her 6 months ago self. "No hug for me?" he said. The girl's eyes sparkled and she quickly threw herself into his arms before she started sobbing. "Luo Ning really missed you a lot," Nangong Lingxin said. "She was sleeping with me or her older brother since we came here because she often burst into tears." Bai Zemin simply caressed the girl's back and whispered that he was fine and nothing bad had happened. At the end of the day, Luo Ning saw him no different from a father figure since it was he who brought light into her life when they first met at the Four Big Bosses camp, the first human base to fall under Bai Zemin's control after leaving the university. "Big brother." A voice filled with joy and delight came from the distance, but Bai Zemin had barely raised his head when a pink shadow entered his arms, smashing Luo Ning between the two of them. Pink shadow? Bai Zemin lowered his head and his eyes met with some long light pink hair. At the same time, a pair of bright pink eyes slightly deeper than the hair color shone as she stared at him. "Big brother, I missed you so much." The girl smiled, showing her small but sharp white teeth. "This? You? Xiao Xiao?" Bai Zemin was really surprised even though in his heart he was expecting it. Xiao Xiao had the physical appearance of a 16-year-old girl, a great beauty indeed. Her curves were small, but certainly very charming, and her soulful eyes seemed to sparkle with longing and innocence as she stared at him intently. Hee. Now the two of us can talk." Xiao Xiao smiled brightly. Her face was a little flushed, probably embarrassed by her attitude, but she had missed him too much to turn away over something as simple as that. "Your human form is very beautiful, Xiao Xiao." Bai Zemin smiled and used one of his hands to pet the long pink hair of the little dolphin who always loved to be in his arms. The others watched the scene a little dumbfounded. Xiao Xiao always looked at everyone with indifference and would not let anyone touch a single hair on her head. In fact, if anyone besides Luo Ning, the Wen sisters, or Bai Sherlin dared to touch her. Xiao Xiao immediately reacted violently, and not a few soul evolvers had to be treated by mages after being sent flying upon being hit by a powerful jet of water in the chest. Seeing the indifferent and fierce Xiao Xiao behaving like a spoiled brat was certainly something they did not expect, even though those present knew that she was that little pink dolphin that accompanied Bai Zemin. Human leader Bai Zemin, looks like your time clock is broken? A cold voice sounded from behind the group, and when Bai Zemin saw this woman he had to make a new beauty ranking immediately. Lilith aside, Bai Zemin thought that he would never meet a woman capable of matching Shangguan Bing Shui in terms of beauty, let alone surpassing her. However, the woman before him certainly had all the qualifications to stand on equal footing with her. Bright blue hair long to just above her hips, a perfectly proportioned body partially covered by an imperial blue dress that exposed two beautiful shiny white legs. Her face seemed to have been carefully chiseled by divine hands, and her slightly cold deep blue eyes matched the small pearl embedded in the center of her forehead. You are 5 months late for our meeting, she said, staring him straight in the eyes. Bai Zemin smiled and sighed in relief. I'm glad you're well. 7th Princess Xietain Mayer. Chapter 949. Fourth Order seeking difficult situation. Troops composed of heavily armed military and soul evolvers began to scour the base in vehicles and on foot in groups in tight formations to avoid being surprised in case there were still any enemies alive. Under direct orders from Bai Zemin, they all began to search for any kind of human life or resources that could be used. They were definitely going to find something. The base was massive after all. He did not have the courage to continue searching after encountering the 5 young women from before. Bai Zemin feared he would end up losing the thread of sanity that kept him in the fortress without letting him charge straight to a place where he did not know what he would run into. As for the person in question, he was currently sitting inside one of the most luxurious buildings in the Mother Fortress along with Fu Xiafeng, Nangong Yi, Nangong Lingxin, Luo Ning, Xiao Xiao, and Xietain Mayer. Despite the goblin's ugly appearance, those little creatures were not so bad when it came to architecture and design. In fact, because the goblin's sense of beauty was not too different from that of humans, it could be said that their leaders had certainly taken their time to make environments in which one would want to be able to spend a lot of time relaxing. In a large room whose floor was covered with some sort of smooth, flat golden stone, Bai Zemin looked at Xietain Mayer, waiting for her to begin speaking. However, Xietain Mayer looked at him with a weird expression on her face. In fact, she wasn't the only one looking at him like that. What's wrong? Bai Zemin asked in confusion. No, not that anything is wrong, but... The eyes of Xietain Mayer darted back and forth before she asked quietly, Human leader Bai Zemin, I know this doesn't concern me, but I have to admit I'm curious about it. No, that's why. What are you talking about? Bai Zemin asked, feeling even more confused than before. Xietain Mayer took a deep breath and finally looked him in the eyes as she said softly, You really like little girls, don't you? No, believe me, I understand where you got that conclusion from, I really do, Bai Zemin said in a serious voice. He could feel his eyebrow trembling slightly as he tried to stay calm and said slowly, However, you're wrong. Completely wrong. Sitting on his right thigh, Bai Sherlin slept comfortably, resting her little head on him. Her chest was rising and falling rhythmically while Bai Zemin used one of his arms to hug her and keep her from falling. On his left thigh, Luo Ning seemed to have returned to her childish self now that Bai Zemin was back. The girl hugged him tightly while looking at everything with curious eyes that sparkled like gems under the dim illumination of some resplendent stones. Last but not least, Xiao Xiao was sitting in the space between his legs with a warm smile on her cute face. She had been glued to Bai Zemin from the first second without wanting to move away at all, and this time was no exception to the rule. Xietain Mayer cleared her throat again as she gave the 3 girls a quick glance. If you say so. She nodded without looking very persuaded. Bai Zemin sighed in his heart. Being a good big brother and good father was certainly hard in this day and age. One could no longer do good deeds without being looked at with weird eyes. Somehow I think I feel as if a certain someone is looking for some kind of self-justification or self-comfort in his heart. Xietan's eyebrow trembled even more fiercely than before upon hearing the words Lilith whispered in his ear, but he wisely did not react big but instead focused on the mermaid princess seated in front of him. It had been about an hour since Xietain had met this group, and after giving some orders and finding a comfortable place to talk about serious matters, the first thing he did was to narrate a bit of his experiences, painting a clear picture in everyone's mind of how difficult his situation had been during the last half a year. This was especially the case for Xietain, who needed to understand that Xietain did not break the agreement they had reached half a year ago of his own free will, but simply had no second choice. After a moment of silence, Xietain nodded calmly. I understand. I admit that I was furious with you back then, Xietain. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that I needed and need your strength and the strength of your people, I would have broken our alliance agreement when you did not keep your word that day. Xietain frowned slightly but swallowed what he felt and was planning to say. No excuses were necessary, no matter how valid they were. The irrefutable truth was that he had broken his word even if he hated it. Don't worry, I'm not mad at you anymore. Xietain waved her hand as she saw the expression on his face, dismissing it as nothing more than a thing of the past. She sighed softly and crossed her right leg over her left in a slow, graceful motion as she let her head touch the back of the couch she was sitting on. However, many things got messed up because of that late lapse of 5 months. We will have to work very hard and risk our lives, human leader Xietain. And I'm afraid this time it will be even tougher than the battle against the beast leader and zombie leader back then. The expression on everyone's face was tremendously serious after Xietain said these words, even though they already knew roughly what was happening. Xietain couldn't help but narrow his eyes slightly as he realized that conquering this part of the country might not be a simple task even for him. As for the reason, he would probably find out in an instant. Princess Xietain, can you explain to me what the hell is going on in the sea? I heard that your sea race seems determined to set foot on the mainland for some reason that I don't understand. Xietain said in a deep voice. Xietain nodded and silently thanked the tea that one of the soldiers prepared for them in the absence of a maid on site. After taking a sip, she took about a minute or two of silence to settle her thoughts and memories, before opening her mouth softly. I don't know exactly when did this happen, but according to my estimation, it must have been somewhere between 8 and 7 months ago. As you already know, I am the 7th princess in my family, which means my siblings are numerous. However, none of those siblings of mine saw me as a threat in their paths of conquest towards the throne of the East Sea royal family. Not only was I not interested in the title of Forgotten Queen, but the number of subordinates I had on hand was so small that I was never considered worthy of attention by any of them. However, this changed after that battle in the middle of the sea. Xietain paused and looked at Xietain silently. You mean the agreement we reached? He questioned. That is correct. Xietain nodded and continued in a serious voice. After reaching an agreement with you, I began to think, why not? If they could, then I certainly could do it. I never lacked ability, but my goals were different. But after listening to you that day, I realized that from my position I will never be able to change anything, which finally led me to make the decision to build my own army. Xietain could remember that during the 4-race war on the bridge in the middle of the Xietain, the subordinates of Mayor were numerous from his point of view. However, she really lacked powerhouses. Most of her subordinates at that time were just unclassified fish with some first-order crabs and lobsters. She only had the support of 1 or 2 second-order sharks, but that was about it. Thanks to our deal, I suddenly had a large amount of food and soul stones that I used to recruit a large number of soldiers from my race in the sea. I even managed to recruit 5 second-order and 1 third-order powerhouse in a very short time. It was at this point that the troubles for me began. Xietain sighed. Your siblings began to see you as a threat when they saw your fast growth. Xietain said in a deep voice. Yeah. Xietain nodded. She, who had stayed passive for so long, suddenly began to recruit tens of thousands of soldiers per day and even high-level powerhouses. It was impossible for her siblings not to see her as a threat after a few months, and seeing how fast she was growing, I somehow managed to withstand the assault of my siblings. Not to brag, but when it comes to magic talent, I'm probably the best in my whole family, Xietain Mayer said in a serious voice, without any hint of arrogance. But, not long before you were forced to open a portal to the other world, one of my brothers suddenly rose with a speed even higher than I did, despite the fact that I was backed by you and your people. Xietain always sent a large camp of zombie corpses into the East Sea within the area that Xietain Mayer controlled. During his presence, millions of zombies were delivered to her, and among them, there was certainly no shortage of zombies with soul stones in their brains. In return, Xietain Mayer fully supported Shangguan Bing Shui during the conquest of the entire west coast of China. She lost many soldiers in the process, but definitely kept her side of the deal. With this, the power under Xietain Mayer control was growing by leaps and bounds, and she was no longer seen as the useless seventh princess who daydreamed about peace foolishly, but her siblings began to see her as a tough opponent they needed to face. Xietain could tell by the change in the slightly sharp gaze of Xietain Mayer that she had certainly experienced countless hardships during this time. Faster than you? Even with all the resources you are getting from the mainland? He frowned sharply upon hearing this. Xietain Mayer nodded. One of my older brothers, Xian Kuan, third prince of the East Sea royal family. He was always the most mysterious of them all. Not only is he very cunning, but he is incredibly hard to read since he always has a smile on his face. Although the third prince was always powerful, the first prince and the first princess never saw Xian Kuan as a true rival until a few months ago. Xietain Mayer frowned and paused before continuing. The third prince suddenly appeared with a huge army after disappearing for 2 whole months. Human leader Xietain, when I say he appeared with a huge army, I'm talking about a huge army. So much so that the 20 million zombies we killed on the bridge that day is nothing but a joke in comparison. The army that the third prince carried with him is not only huge, but also has hundreds of second-order powerhouses and even some third-order soul evolvers. Xian Kuan began attacking the territories under the control of the other princes and princesses without delay, and although he lost several powerhouses in the process, the number of his army didn't seem to decrease much, even though the deep waters were dyed crimson red after months of war. Xietain remained silent as the draw of the painting began to become clearer to him. Not only did the third prince's numbers grow exponentially overnight, but he also obtained some kind of ridiculous treasure that somehow assists his troops to evolve faster. Xietain Mayer frowned deeply and said in a serious voice, "My brother Xian Kuan visited my royal father, and after a conversation of several hours he left the throne room with his trademark smile. A few days later, my royal father suddenly and somehow became a fourth-order soul evolver, and the third prince began to attack the mainland with strong tenacity." Fourth order? Xietan's pupils contracted slightly as he looked at the mermaid princess in shock. Xietain Mayer seemed to know what was going through his head as she nodded. "That's why I said things got too complicated now. Besides, that's not the worst of it." Chapter 950 Enemy Attack. The meeting between Xietain and Xietain Mayer lasted longer than he thought it would. It wasn't until almost midnight that the two finally parted ways, and just like everyone else, they headed to their respective rooms. The fortress mother was no different than a ghost base at this point. Its massive size was simply too much for it to be occupied by just a little over 2,000 men. Moreover, even though Xietain had taken care of almost all the blood that ran like rivers between the fortress buildings, the smell of death accompanied by the howling of the night wind was really too terrifying. 3 teams were divided into 3 turns, each team 1 turn, to occupy defensive positions on the walls. Soldiers and soul evolvers alike took it upon themselves to fire the goblin magic cannons immediately at the slightest sign of problems, which would alert the lead monsters resting in the center of the base. "Do you think the goblins will attack with the intention of taking back this fortress?" a soldier asked as he smoked a cigarette with an expression of delight on his face. "No, they won't do that. his companion replied. This other soldier took out a box of cigarettes with 5 units, and after lighting one he inhaled the smoke deeply before blowing it out slowly with a relaxed expression on his face. With leader by back, those goblins will be calling for death if they dare to come over here. They probably know it too now that the mother fortress fell into our hands in no time at all. But the leader is certainly a soul evolver apart. A soul evolver near the 2 soldiers' side. He single-handedly did what our entire faction together did not dare to do. And he did it in less than 1 day. Sometimes I wonder how it's possible for him to have become so strong. I mean, it's not like I haven't risked my life several times to level up, you know? No one gave me my soul power for free. Hey, Yuan. What do you mean when you say our faction didn't dare? Our main troop was focusing on taking back the rest of the country. The higher leaders couldn't just send the strongest ones to take over a single territory. Besides, the first soldier hesitated for a moment before saying quietly, from what I heard, the leader fought against first-order mutant beasts when he was only level 10 or so. What? How could something like that even be possible? At the lowest levels, a soul evolver shouldn't even have too many skills that would allow them to close such a huge gap. Well, that's what many say. Forget it, who cares? For better or worse, it is true that the lives of all of us have improved thanks to him and the other leaders. True, now practically everyone in the military can afford a box of cigarettes every half-month, luxuries that only the government could afford a few months ago. In his room, Bai Zemin looked at Bai Shilin, Xiao Xiao, and Luo Ning who followed him here. He naturally had no problem with any of them, especially Bai Shilin. However, and yet, he had an ironic expression on his face as he slowly said, Xiao Xiao, Luo Ning. You girls want to come with me? Xiao Xiao nodded without hesitation. Big brother, just for tonight, please? Luo Ning looked at him with puppy eyes. In that case, don't resist the force of attraction you will feel, he said. 2 seconds later, Luo Ning started to yell in surprise as she looked at the new world. As for Xiao Xiao, she was like an octopus that clung to Bai Zemin without letting him go anywhere, even ignoring everything around her. What will you do now? Lilith asked, keeping herself in her lily form. She was already there by the time they arrived, and since both Luo Ning and Xiao Xiao had seen her before, they weren't too surprised. For now. Bai Zemin walked towards the still unfinished house and stretched his body as he said in a tired voice, let's take some sleep. Lilith looked at his back, and knowing that things were going to get rough soon, nodded gently. You're right. Let's get some sleep. The treasure bed was very large, at least twice the size of a king-size bed. Therefore, it was no problem for Bai Zemin to lie down in the middle and sleep comfortably with Bai Shilin, Xiao Xiao, Luo Ning, and Lilith. Although both Bai Zemin's stamina and mana were almost at 100%, he was mentally and spiritually tired. Not only had he taken a huge base with only Bai Shilin's support, but he had also learned from Xian Mayer that his absence had given rise to others to grow and explore, which now ended up biting him in the butt. After sleeping for about 8 hours in the collector's pocket world, which meant that it had not even been an hour in the outside world, Bai Zemin slowly opened his eyes and stared at the wooden ceiling with a dazed expression. He had had a dream, a long dream, a very strange, but at the same time important one. Unfortunately, he could not remember no matter how hard he focused or tried. After a few minutes, Bai Zemin gently shook his head, and seeing that even Lilith was still sleeping comfortably hugging Bai Shilin, he was very careful to stand up. Thanks to all the people present trusting in him completely, none of them woke up when Bai Zemin left the house. After looking for a tree with some shadow, he sat down comfortably and looked at his status window. There, Bai Zemin saw that apart from the normal stats they all had from the beginning, a new stat called Spiritual Power was glowing softly as if calling out to him. Spiritual Power, 1. It wasn't the first time Bai Zemin had seen it, of course. However, so far he had not dared to do anything with that 1 point of spiritual power. 1 point of spiritual power. Spiritual power is definitely a significantly higher energy than mana. I can say that for sure even though I only have 1 point. He muttered as he rubbed his chin. However, I'm still not sure what can form such energy or why it appeared in the first place. The problem was that, unlike mana which came from a mysterious and powerful entity called Soul Record, spiritual power was coming out of a memory seal, which was extremely rare. No matter how much he thought about it, Baizemin couldn't find a logical answer to all of this. Besides, Baizemin frowned and a glint of worry shone in his eyes. Who can guarantee me that if I use the spiritual power point then it will recover? No, for one thing, how the hell will I get it resupplied after I spend it? Different from the mana that was everywhere. The spiritual power was inside the seal of memories, but that seal was not as vast as the entire universe that was filled with mana. Due to his doubts and insecurity, Baizemin did not dare to touch that single and pitiful point. His curiosity certainly wasn't worth taking such a risk. At least not now. Baizemin closed his eyes, and for the first time since the events of the staircase to heaven, he began to hit the memory seal with his soul. However, unlike that time when he desperately attacked taking the risk of damaging his soul, Baizemin was very patient and struck only hard enough so that once the pile of damage reached a certain point, it would cause a bigger crack than what was already in the seal. Time passed slowly but surely, and when Lilith and the little girls woke up, the first thing they saw when they left the house was Baizemin sitting in the lotus position with his back resting comfortably on the trunk of a large tree not far from the front door. She motioned them to silence so that they would not disturb him upon seeing the girls' curiosity and took them far away enough so that the noise would not become a problem. However, even after training for 15 whole hours, the four found Baizemin sitting in the same position as before with the only difference being the night sky above their heads. Baisherlin, Xiao Xiao, and Luo Ning went to sleep under the insistence of Lilith, who explained a little of the difference in the passage of time within this world when she noticed the concern in Luo Ning and Xiao Xiao's eyes. It was only after learning that there would be no change in the war that the two girls agreed to go to rest after a long day of training their abilities. 1, 2, 3, 4. The days inside the collector's pocket watch passed one after another, and as Lilith guided them in this world without so many restrictions, the three girls began to grow in experience in terms of both hand-to-hand combat and physical strength control, as well as in the mastery of their mana and magic power. Big sister Lily, big brother is really fine? Luo Ning asked worriedly as she looked at Baizemin sitting in the same position as before. Today is the 5th day since we have come here, but he still hasn't moved from that place. He hasn't even changed his position at all. He's fine, don't worry, Lilith said with some confusion flashing in her eyes. Even she had no idea what Baizemin was doing. Was he trying to feel some law to study it? She didn't know, but she wasn't worried either as she could feel his aura as stable and steady as ever. It was exactly when 5 days had passed, 120 hours since they had entered the collector's pocket world, that Baizemin opened his eyes. He blinked a little confused, but was soon marveled by the pretty deep pink eyes staring at him. Xiao Xiao? What are you doing? Xiao Xiao closed her eyes and they practically curved into a crescent shape as she smiled sweetly. Big brother, you're finally awake. I was just looking at you, no more. Baizemin smiled and ruffled her hair a bit. What's so funny about staring at me? I like staring at you. I feel warm when I'm near you. Xiao Xiao replied as she walked into his embrace. Baizemin chuckled and welcomed her warmly. Xiao Xiao was a spiritual dolphin, a super rare species in the entire universe according to Lilith. She could sense and communicate to some extent with people's souls. And apart from Baizemin and innocent children, the only living being Xiao Xiao allowed to touch her was, precisely, Xietain. However, she certainly loved more than anything to hold Baizemin in order to be close to his soul. And now that he knew a little more about the secrets hidden in his soul, it didn't seem too strange to her. After a few minutes, Baizemin and Xiao stood up and went to look for Baisherlin and the rest. When they saw him, Baisherlin and Luo Ning immediately ran to hug him and say good morning, causing a wry smile on Baizemin's face. Good morning? He hadn't been sleeping at all. Seeing that Lilith was looking at him in confusion, he briefly explained what he had been doing all this time. I see. She nodded with a slight frown. Xietain, be careful with that seal. Don't rush and take your time. Remember that messing with the soul or anything in it is no joke. You could cause irreparable damage if you're careless. I know, don't worry. Xietain nodded with a serious expression. That's precisely why I'm taking my time patiently. Even though I haven't been able to make bigger that crack I made before, it will eventually happen. That's good for you to know. Lilith smiled, visibly relieved. Actually, if not for the existence of the collector's pocket watch, Xietain would not be so relaxed right now, considering that in less than 6 years 70% of the life in the universe would disappear unless he had the strength to fight against the beings of the Golden Domain that would arrive on this plane by then. It was only thanks to this wonderful demigod-grade treasure that he was a little more comfortable with the time he had. Although 120 hours had passed for Xietain and the others, for everyone in the outside world it had only been 12 hours. Lilith pretended to stay in the collector's pocket world while he took the 3 girls to lunch as it was past 12 noon. It was a few hours later when a fleet of over 50,000 humans from the south arrived at the base, and under the leadership of Xietain and his trusted men, they began to set in motion all the defense mechanisms of the Mother Fortress. Just before nightfall, an agility-type soul evolver quickly came to the place where Xietain and the others were resting, and once she was allowed to go in, she brought news that somehow didn't surprise the people present very much. Leader by a very big army of goblins and sea beasts was spotted 20 kilometers in an easterly direction, announced the soul evolver with a slightly pale face. There are millions of them, but we only have about 55,000 people here, among which not all of them can fight. Xietain brushed his mouth before casually tossing the napkin on the table and standing up. I had planned to start the attack tomorrow. The reason Xietain had planned to wait one more day before continuing the attack was to give his people time to get ready. After all, this would be a great war according to what Xietain said before, a war that would not end in 1 or 2 days. Xietain needed people. He needed his army, and he was going to mobilize it since he had built it for this kind of circumstance in the first place. But since they are sending us a gift beforehand, then we'd better go receive it.